Well, hey guys, happy Sunday night. I am so thrilled to be back with you. Missed you guys the past couple weeks, and there's just so much to talk about. But I want to welcome Kyle, my libertarian friend, back to Refounding Fathers. Good to see you, buddy.
Thanks, man. Glad to be here.
And then Chris, my liberal friend, frequent guest on our shows and on our page, and an awesome guy. Thank you so much for being back on as well.
Happy to be on the show as usual, and I hope that you're feeling better and are fully recovered from the brutal Antifa attack on you last week.
Yeah, we're there immediately. So last week, I was so thrilled because we were going to get into all the content and stuff that we're going to get into tonight, talking about the 1776 project and the 1619 project, and I was so excited to do that, and that did not happen, and it is entirely and utterly my fault, and I am thoroughly embarrassed. I wish I had a really good story because we did our Cobra Kai episode, where we dissected Cobra Kai and like had all of our trivia games and everything else. And I wish I could say that I like beat the crap out of some like punk kid or like, use my Miyagi-Do to defend some person in distress. I did not. I was like, hey, I'll go for a run. And then, I'm going to do this Refounding Fathers show. And I went for a couple miles and it's very dark in Florida. That's my excuse. And I tripped, and I was like, whatever, it's fine. I skinned my knee. Like, it happens, right? Like, my kids do it, pretty much every day that we take a walk. And I get up, I make it back to the car. I go about 100 meters. I get back to the car, and I look, and there's this enormous, like, gash in my leg. And I'm not going to show it to you. I did not take any pictures. My wife has seen it. My kids were horrified. But I literally, when I got home, it was right before the blood started coming out, right? And I like called my wife and I was like, "Can you meet me outside?" Like I didn't want to like traumatize my kids immediately. So I was in the ER this time last week, and like 4 or 5 stitches at least. I'd have to look and count them here, but like at first I was just like, it's a cut, and then I was like, wait. That's not red. That's white. What is that? Like, and I still don't know. Like, is it a bone or is it a tendon? Like, I'm not a doctor, so I don't know. But it was thoroughly embarrassing because, as far as I know, it was like concrete. I don't like the theory is that there was some kind of like blade or something sticking up out of the earth, like trying to assault me. Yeah, that's where I was. I was like, man, I would much rather be here talking to you guys about life and politics and stuff, and instead I was like getting stitched up and telling a poor nurse like about our show. So, but anyway, so I've been rehabbing the past week, and I get my stitches out here in a few days. So there you go. But how have you guys been? How have the past 2 weeks been? I believe this is our first show since Biden got inaugurated. So let's talk about that first before we get into the real meat. Kyle, I mean, what are your thoughts as you see the transition from Trump to Biden? You see his first days. I think it's over 40 executive orders. I think I read.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the world we're living in now under Biden? Is it different substantially, or is it more the same? How do you see it as a libertarian?
Sure. Well, first, let me say, I hope you are feeling better. I hope your knees feeling better. I'm a Bible believing man, and I think I sent you a Bible verse that, I think Proverbs 28:1, that's my own kind of translation, says the wicked man, or actually the fool runs when no one is chasing him. And so that kind of that sums up how I feel about running for exercise right there. For the whole, I can't tell you how many times after the election when I was on Twitter or Instagram, I kept seeing my leftist friends saying, "We toppled a dictator. We toppled a dictator."
Yeah.
And 2 weeks in, we've got 40 executive orders. So I'm not sure we've toppled a dictator so much as we replaced one bad politician with a guy who's ruling by executive fiat, and that's not a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, there was all this talk about bipartisanship and we need to heal and all those things. How do you see the message, Chris? As someone who's supported Biden, you've talked about that on this show and in many other places. How would you judge the first couple weeks of his presidency?
Well, I certainly would prefer to see a government that is run less by executive order and more by action in Congress. I think a lot of that is motivated not just by each successive president flexing their own power and expanding the powers of the executive, which is what we have seen over the past 4 decades, maybe. I also think part of that is due to congressional inaction and the lack of any real incentive or motivation by Congress to act. I think they'd really prefer that presidents do everything. That way they don't have the pressure of having to actually make decisions. And then they can just, post stuff on Twitter all day, appeal to
let me push back on that. So Democrats have the House, Democrats have the Senate. Instead of trying to get meaningful legislation passed, they're trying to impeach a president retroactively. I mean, they could be doing work instead of having Joe Biden just sign executive orders all day.
Ooh, what do you think, Chris?
Well, I mean, I think they can do both. And I think the impeachment, which has already happened, so they've already successfully impeached him.
Right. It's at the
Senate.
The Senate, right, yeah.
Which that could be over tomorrow if Republicans would acknowledge that Trump committed abuses of power and needs to be convicted to send a message. But then again, I think that a lot of presidents should have been impeached. I think the fact that we've never successfully impeached and convicted a president is kind of a travesty. But, it couldn't happen to a nicer guy if the very first successful conviction was for President Trump.
Well,
it's not going to happen.
I think about it, and there's this kind of like honeymoon period for like a new president, a new administration, and in this case, a shift in the Senate. And Trump had it when he started, and it was, what is he going to do with his first, few months of office? And there's only so much you can do. We've talked about this on our show numerous times, is that, the founders envisioned this to be a government in which you really had to work hard to get anything done with all the competing powers, dual federalism, all that stuff. So this is one of those times where you can get things done, and especially if you have it all in your party. And one of the things that I would like to see is some fundamental shifts in terms of limiting how much influence certain positions have. I mean, you can look at term limits and things like that, balanced budget amendments. There's so many other things that can be done. Line item vetoes would be a great one. And I was hoping that Trump would do that in his first few, days of office when he had it, and he didn't. I think he was focused on the travel ban at the time, which was something that he had promised and stuff. So it is interesting to me as we go forward in this. Is this Biden just setting the stage for what he's going to do in the future, or is this kind of a one-time deal to try to show how tough he is? I don't know. So it's going to be interesting to walk through over the next few months and really see what he's going to be like. I want to talk about this, though, because as we get into the practical politics, and we do that all the time on this show, one of the things we can also do is we can talk about kind of like the philosophical piece of what's behind it. And in terms of action by Biden, is he has taken some steps to be able to change some of the publications that were coming out of White House offices and the administrations. And two of them that he talked about, and it's kind of the topic of our show tonight, is there was this project by the New York Times called the 1619 Project, and then there was something that the White House was doing or sponsoring, which was the 1776 Project. And Trump had been authorizing this, and Biden shut it down. So I want to talk about that. I want to get your thoughts on that too, because how the practical politics play out is going to be interesting. But the philosophical piece of this can kind of give us trying to answer that question of how Biden's going to be in the future. Maybe this speaks to it and kind of gives us what he's thinking behind the scenes. So when you look at this project, the 1619 Project, really what was happening is the New York Times back in 2019 was looking at trying to sponsor research and articles and journalism on a different way to look at American history and the world we live in. And they were trying to do so through the lens of slavery and the first people who came over to America as slaves. And so they were looking at this and they said, let's start with 1619, since that's an important date as people showed up via the slave trade. And so they started to try to reshape how we think about American history to be able to cast light and to start to look through the next years leading up to now through that lens and what actually stands out versus the way that history is more commonly taught, where this is something that occurred, but perhaps not the most quintessential thing that occurred in American history. This was controversial. There was a lot of pushback on this, a lot of people defending it, and it's something that, again, has been going on now for a couple years. In response to this, the Trump administration authorized what was called the 1776 Project. And this was, hey, instead of looking at that particular date in slavery, we're going to talk about it within our articles and our publications, but we're going to put the focus on the American founders. We're going to look at the Declaration of Independence. We're going to look at the Constitution, and we're going to talk about the brilliance and the genius that was behind that and how that set the stage for success. And ultimately, they argued the unraveling of slavery and kind of a defocusing of race relations in general. And so Trump had this thing going. One of my frustrations, which we can talk about, is that we really didn't get much out of this project until right before Trump left office in the last couple of days. And so that was kind of surprising to me. But they did release, essentially a manifesto of what their project is about. And that's what Biden has shut down. And so you see two different competing lenses through which that we view our own country. And that's what I want to talk to you guys about, because I guess my first one is, having looked at both of those and seen some of the results of it, and obviously listen to me talk about it, do you think it's fair to say, hey, this is a valid viewpoint, and in terms of 1776, and so was 1619, or do you see one or the other, in terms of exclusion? I would start with Kyle, and we'll go to Chris on that. But what are your thoughts in general about these two, completely different conclusions about what's important in our history?
Sure. Yeah. So I'll say that, just start off by saying I'm a history nerd. That's basically the only podcast I listen to are history podcasts. I love history. In another life, I'd probably be a history teacher. And I will say this about both the 1619 Project and the 1776 Commission. Neither of them are actual history. Both of them are historical proof texting. It's agenda and it's worldview and indoctrination with just historical proof texting behind it. They both come to the table with a specific worldview. 1619 Project with Nicole Hannah-Jones basically says the U.S. is a fundamentally flawed, evil country because we have done all these things with slavery. There's some valid arguments there. The 1776 Commission says that our country is fundamentally good, maybe even saying beyond that. Maybe even, in fact, I would say probably arguably saying beyond that, saying that not only are we fundamentally good, we're basically flawless, and that's problematic as well. So both of them, are problematic. I don't think either of them really have a place. On one side, it's activist journalism. On the other side, it's historical propaganda funded by the government. So as a libertarian, I'd say no to both.
Yeah, I mean, so the controversy with the 1776 Project, before we go to Chris, was there wasn't a lot of historians on this. There was like the president of Hillsdale. There was, conservative think tank members. There was, people who do this, for a living, doing podcasts and things like that. Those folks were on it. And they did speak to slavery. I mean, you had like MLK was, featured in it. Frederick Douglass was in the thing. But it was kind of talking about this founding period in America as this glamorous, like incredible time where they happened upon these eternal truths that have propelled us to greatness. And that's what a lot of the conservative rhetoric is. I know, being a conservative and being on all the channels and things like that. But yeah, there's a lot of criticism for that, because people say, well, hold on a minute. These founders, the vast majority of them owned slaves. You can say what you want about Jefferson and what he tried to put into the Declaration of Independence, but he was doing all these other things on the side. And so how can we glamorize them too much? That's the criticism from the left. So What do you think, Chris? Do you see any value whatsoever in the 1776 project, or do you think it's propaganda?
Well, I think that there is a lot of really valid criticism of the 1619 project as an objective history. I don't think it, I think Kyle is right that a lot of it is not history. And I don't think the intent was necessarily for it to represent objective history. A lot of the 1619 project is made up of poems, personal essays, op eds. It certainly is activist journalism in the way that really all editorials are. And I think that many historians, including Black historians and historians on the left, pointed to some historical inaccuracies. Kyle mentions Nicole Hannah-Jones, who in one of the essays says that part of the reason for the American Revolution was so that the founders could preserve slavery because they were afraid that the British were going to abolish slavery a little bit earlier than their timetable, which, according to some historians that I've seen, is not necessarily accurate. Right. However, when Nicole Hannah-Jones is writing about her personal experiences with racism, her family's history with segregation, it's beautiful and it's powerful. And there are many times in the 1619 Project where these Black writers are making these profound personal connections between their history and their lives and structural and historical problems in the United States. So I think that the critiques are valid, and I think it is necessary to have a good faith counter argument by historians. The 1776 Project was not that. Yeah. And the reason we know that is because there were no historians on the panel. I think the closest thing was Victor Davis Hanson, who is a classicist, and he used to be a professor at my alma mater, Fresno State, and he's kind of gone like full Trumpy over the past 4 years. Charlie Kirk was on it. So, they couldn't get any historians, but they got Charlie Kirk, so that's important. And of course, 1776 Project had its own share of historical inaccuracies, such as arguing that Martin Luther King Jr. Was opposed to affirmative action, when actually many of his writings support affirmative action. To add insult to injury, this was released on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Right. So I don't see the 1776 Commission as a good faith attempt to get objective history taught. I think really it was kind of just a tribal chest thumping thing. They didn't produce any actual history or documents because that wasn't the goal. The goal was for people to point to something and say, those people over there are getting a little bit too uppity. So here's our response. We're not going to believe in that version of history. We're going to believe that America is perfect.
Yeah, I mean, you both kind of made valid criticisms insofar as, and they say it at times in the projects would, I wouldn't agree with either, that this is how it really happened, right? This is what's really important. And they reach forward to some of that objectivity. I don't really see the value in it from that point. What I see the value in both of these projects is that they say, okay, this is our viewpoint, right? So on the 1776 Project, we're really big fans of freedom. Liberty, it's awesome. And so let's look at history with that lens and see what comes to light, right? It's like a black light and you shine it and you see, things that you normally don't see. And then in the same thing, the 1619 Project, let's look at this, these past several hundred years with a particular influence, guiding it, and that being race relations. And let's see what comes to the forefront. And sometimes it can be very shocking because you see the same event from, like you said, the founding from very different viewpoints. I think back to, I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and I don't live there now, but I remember going to high school and I remember the perspective being very different there versus Virginia, where we moved to, and even here in Florida, because Memphis had all of this backstory and history. You talked about MLK, things like that. There's this entire history that is very acutely felt, even today, in Memphis. And I remember seeing the world through those lenses. And then you go to other places, we go up to like New England, where my wife is from. And, most people are of the same race. It's not quite as diverse in certain areas. And so, their entire viewpoint is very, very different. You talk about MLK and yeah, sure, whatever, but in Memphis, it's like, yeah, he was shot right down the street over here. There's a museum that everyone's been to. And so what's important about history a lot of times can can belly our values, and at least in these projects, they're doing that. And I'm not, the inaccuracies absolutely is a problem, but I appreciate that there was at least this chance to discuss. Hey, this is what we see in important American history. 1776, the folks behind this, the liberals that did that, blew right by it and saw it differently, and they focused on that. To me, that's interesting. Like, why? Why did you do that? And then with the conservatives, they were elevating the founding of it as if this was this amazing, perfect thing, and there's a discussion that needs to be had there in terms of the values behind, that led you to do that. And that's bringing it back to the Biden administration. I wonder if we're going to have that opportunity. I wonder if we're going to be given the chance to be able to have different values in this country and those values heard. I don't feel like in the Trump administration we did that very much with liberals, right? Having talked to so many folks who are ardent Trump supporters and love, almost everything the president did. One of the things that they're quick to do is to say liberals don't belong in this country. Their values don't belong in this country. They're a disease. They're an enemy, that kind of thing. And they don't give them any space. I wonder in the Biden administration, oh, yeah, you're one of those 1776ers, right? Get out of here. Like you don't deserve a seat at the table. How do we get back to a point where we can say, yeah, I don't like your scholarship, but I respect your values? That's really the question. So I'll leave that for you guys, and then any other comments that you have as we kind of close this out. Go ahead, Kyle.
Yeah, I think we have to come to the. I mean, we live in this, postmodern era where truth is subjective, and there is something to the fact that a truth can have different implications and mean different things to different people. But the truth is the truth, right? And I remember, this is a famous AOC saying, and then Joe Biden echoed it. Said we believe in facts over truth. Or truth over facts, or whatever it was. But it's basically, you can have the truth, but ultimately we want to be morally right, no matter what the facts are. And I think we see this on both sides. We see this, like Chris was saying, with Nicole Hannah-Jones saying, this is an event that happened, and then this is how it has affected my family down the line. And we see it on both sides of that. And I think we can agree that a fact happened, and we can agree that it affects people differently, but ultimately can't change what the facts are, and we can't go back retroactively and try to imply or project a narrative or motives into things like that. So we could talk on it for a long time. I know we're running out of time, but
that's something we can get into in future shows. That's so interesting because I think about the news, and there's so many times people say I want the news to be objective. Well, when you work in a news organization, you still have to choose what is going to be covered on the front page. Like if you're expecting CNN to cover, glowing stories of religion, they're just not going to do it because it's not a focus of their network, right? They're focused on international relations. They're focused on big political movements. That's their focus.
So David Barton famously does this with people on the right. Like David Barton is a evangelical Christian historian, and he views the founding through the lens of like this super Christian narrative, which just doesn't exist. And it's the same thing. He's like, this event happened, and he's projecting his version of evangelical Christianity into the founding, which just is not there. We got to be careful of that.
There's a balance in this, right? Like I get what you're saying, and that there are things that things that happen versus didn't happen, but immediately once something occurs, there's 30, 40, 50 people who have completely different interpretations about what is important, because reality is so complex. And how do we make that distinction? Is
That's right.
network is going to cover this but not that. You have to make choices, and how are you going to phrase it? It's incredible how important that piece is, and how difficult it makes it to get to a point of, what is the truth. The famous example is if you walk down an alley and you heard some kids screaming and there was a man there, what would you think? You might have.
That's right. Yeah.
It could be someone who's trying to like steal that child away from their parents. It could be a evil person, or it could be a doctor who's trying to save her life.
That's
you
right.
don't know until you get more information. So it's negotiating between the factual piece that you talked about and the perspectives piece. And
that's right.
That's where the discussion is required. And that's what I keep telling so many conservatives and things like that on my channels. Like, we need other people not just folks who agree with us, to be able to give us what they're seeing,
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
the truth is so elusive at times and difficult. And if you only see from one perspective, you're likely to miss a lot. So go ahead, Chris, if you want to close this out, any final comments here before we move on?
Yeah, I really like what Kyle brings up about like the concept of truth. Like truth is complex, and it's human nature to like not like that truth is complex and to run from that fact. And so, you see people on the left who kind of sometimes demonize America and decide that we're just kind of like a uh, irredeemable country. And you see people on the right who want to hold America up as perfect when, the truth is that the founding was an amazing leap forward for freedom in the world. But it was also, an event that was primarily acted upon by people who owned slaves and who kept huge swaths of the population from enjoying that freedom.
Yeah.
And those structural things that they put in place, are still with us today. We may be a free country, but one thing I appreciate about the libertarian movement in particular is that they're always looking at ways that we are not fully free and ways that we could be more free.
Yeah.
So the truth is complex. It's really hard to accept complex truths, which is why you see people today who think there's massive like school shootings aren't real,
Right.
because like it's really hard to accept complex truths, and starting from a fair place of facts, unfortunately, is something that has proven very difficult for us as of late.
Yeah.
That's amazing. No, thank you so much for saying that, Chris. Because I mean, and that's why I love this show so much, is we can go back to the founders, and even if we critique them from at times, wish they had done that and they hadn't said that, we can also find value together, even if it's slightly different in terms of what sticks out to us. That's how we get back to this point where we can have a 1776 and a 1619 project talking to each other, is out of that mutual respect, and not being afraid to say, hey, great job libertarians for this, great job liberals for that, conservatives, we want to work on this and we did a good job with that. There's no skin like lost being able to do that. It's just not the current narrative. So thank you guys for contributing to what that can be. Our next show is coming up here in about 5 minutes. We're going to have conservatism on tap, so I can't wait to do that. Thank you guys so much, Chris, Kyle, for being on the show. And then we're going to get more into these deep philosophical concepts. We're going to get more into the practicalities of the Biden administration. Lots more to talk about. So don't forget to follow us on the BurkingConservative.com, YouTube channel, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We're on all of it. And if you got any feedback for us, let us know. We'll be happy to bring that up on the show. Thanks, guys. We'll see you next week.